20 minutes. That is how long Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando disappeared from the Rose Tattoo premiere on December 15, 1955, vanishing into a backstage dressing room while the theater lobby buzzed with speculation. When they emerged, Marilyn's lipstick was smudged, Brando's hair was disheveled, and the gossip columnists in attendance immediately assumed they knew what had happened. Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons exchanged knowing glances. Theater staff whispered behind their hands. Photographers tried desperately to capture the moment, hoping for evidence of Hollywood's newest scandal. But they were all wrong about what had transpired in that locked room. What Marilyn and Marlon did during those 20 minutes was far more intimate than any physical encounter. They talked. They really talked, stripping away the personas they showed the world and revealing the scared, damaged people underneath. Marilyn confessed that she was exhausted from playing the dumb blonde, that she desperately wanted to be taken seriously as an actress, but no one would let her. Brando admitted that he felt like a fraud, that every role was eating away at his soul, that fame had become a prison he could not escape. They discovered they were both studying at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, both trying to use method acting to find something real beneath the Hollywood artifice. By the time they unlocked that dressing room door and returned to the premiere, something profound had shifted. They had become allies in a war against their own images, conspirators in a plot to reclaim their humanity from an industry that wanted only their beauty and their talent. That 20-minute conversation in December 1955 was the beginning of a 7-year relationship that would remain almost entirely invisible to the public, a secret affair that existed in whispered phone calls and hidden meetings, and that would culminate in a desperate phone call 48 hours before Marilyn's death. But on that December night, surrounded by champagne and flashbulbs and false congratulations, neither of them could have imagined how their story would end. If you want to discover the hidden stories behind Hollywood's golden age, the secrets that shaped the legends we still talk about today, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the truth behind the mythology, the human stories behind the icons. New York City in December 1955 pulsed with contradictions. The streets were decorated for Christmas, shop windows glittered with lights, and the air carried that peculiar mix of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts that defined the era. But beneath the festive surface, darker energies stirred. The Cold War was intensifying, McCarthyism had left its scars on the entertainment industry, and a new kind of celebrity culture was emerging, one that would prove far more invasive and destructive than anything that had come before. The Paramount Theater on Times Square stood as a monument to old Hollywood glamour, its Art Deco facade representing an era already beginning to fade. On the night of December 15th, the theater hosted the premiere of The Rose Tattoo, a prestige picture with an A-list guest roster and maximum publicity coverage. The studio publicists had created the concept of celebrity ushers, famous people positioned in the lobby to greet arriving guests, pose for photographs, and add glamour to the proceedings. It was a humiliating assignment for serious actors, reducing them to decorative objects, but it was also one of those Hollywood obligations that could not easily be refused. Among those assigned this duty were Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando, two people who would soon discover they had far more in common than either expected. Marilyn Monroe arrived that evening already exhausted and already performing. She had spent 3 hours in hair and makeup, transforming herself from Norma Jean Baker into the platinum goddess the world expected. Her dress was white and form-fitting, her fur stole pristine white mink. Her smile was the Marilyn smile, practiced in 1,000 mirrors until it became automatic. As her limousine pulled up, she could see the crowd pressing against police barricades, fans screaming her name, flashbulbs creating a strobing effect that made the scene feel unreal. She stepped out into that chaos with the grace of long practice, waving and blowing kisses, giving them exactly what they wanted while feeling absolutely nothing inside. This was her job, her duty, her prison. Marlon Brando arrived 15 minutes later in barely contained hostility. He hated premieres, hated the falseness and spectacle, hated being displayed like a prize animal. His tuxedo fit imperfectly because he had gained weight and refused to have it altered. His bow tie was slightly askew, and he had no intention of fixing it. His expression was somewhere between boredom and contempt, and he made no effort to hide it. The photographers shouted at him to smile, and he ignored them. Brando had already established his reputation as Hollywood's most talented and most difficult actor, and he wore that reputation like armor. When the publicists positioned Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando together as celebrity ushers in the theater lobby, they were thinking only about the photograph, the blonde bombshell and the brooding genius, beauty and intensity, sex appeal and raw talent. It was perfect visual composition. What they did not anticipate was the actual human interaction that would occur when these two people were forced to stand side by side for hours. The moment when Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando first made eye contact that night has been described by witnesses with an almost mythical quality. Brando was standing near the theater entrance, his hands shoved in his pockets despite the formal setting. Marilyn was positioned about 10 feet away, near the ticket window, her smile locked in place as yet another wealthy patron told her how beautiful she was. Their eyes met across that small distance, and for just a moment, the masks slipped. Brando saw past the platinum hair and breathy voice to the intelligence and desperation underneath. Marilyn saw past the masculine bravado and rebellious posturing to the vulnerability and self-doubt. It was a moment of recognition, one performer seeing another and understanding instantly that they were both trapped in the same impossible situation, worshipped by millions and understood by almost no one. Within minutes, they had drifted closer together, their celebrity usher duties conveniently forgotten as they began to talk. The conversation started casually, comments about the cold weather and the crowds and the absurdity of being used as decorative objects. But it quickly became something more, both of them sensing that they could speak more honestly with each other than they usually could with anyone in Hollywood. Brando was struck by how different Marilyn was when she thought no one important was watching. The breathy voice disappeared, replaced by a sharper, more articulate way of speaking. The flirtatious gestures stopped, and instead she stood with her arms crossed defensively. She complained about the premiere with a bitterness that surprised him, calling it a circus and a waste of time. When he mentioned that he also studied with Lee Strasberg, her entire demeanor changed. Suddenly, she was animated and engaged, asking him about his experiences with method acting, sharing her own struggles to apply Strasberg's techniques to the lightweight roles she was always given. Marilyn was equally surprised by Brando. She had seen him in A Streetcar Named Desire and On the Waterfront, had been awed by the raw emotional power of his performances, but she had assumed such intensity must come from someone confident and self-assured. Instead, she found a man who seemed almost as insecure as she was, who questioned his own talent constantly, who felt like an imposter despite the accolades. He told her that he sometimes watched his own performances and felt nothing but disgust, that he worried he was just a good mimic rather than a genuine artist. He confessed that fame terrified him, that he hated being recognized on the street, that he sometimes fantasized about quitting acting entirely. These admissions came pouring out in that theater lobby, perhaps because Marilyn's own vulnerability gave him permission to be vulnerable in return. As the premiere progressed and the lobby began to clear, Marilyn and Marlon found themselves with decreasing supervision and increasing freedom. It was Brando who suggested they escape for a few minutes, nodding toward the backstage area where a maze of dressing rooms offered refuge from the public eye. Marilyn hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, and together they slipped away, moving through corridors that smelled of old paint and costume fabrics until they found an empty dressing room with the number 7 painted on the door. What happened during the next 20 minutes would become the subject of endless speculation and wildly inaccurate gossip. The truth was both simpler and more profound than the sexual encounter everyone assumed had occurred. They sat on the worn couch in that dressing room, still in their formal clothes but no longer performing for anyone, and they talked with a level of honesty that was rare for either of them. Marilyn told Brando about her childhood in foster homes, about the sexual abuse she had endured, about how she had created the Marilyn Monroe persona as a survival mechanism but now felt trapped inside it. Brando shared stories of his own damaged childhood with an alcoholic father who had been verbally and physically abusive. He talked about how acting had initially been an escape, but had become another kind of trap. Every role demanded that he excavate his own pain and trauma, and the process was destroying him slowly. At some point during those 20 minutes, the conversation turned to the actor's studio and to Lee Strasberg specifically. Both had complicated relationships with Strasberg, viewing him simultaneously as a savior and a tormentor. His method acting techniques offered them a path to genuine artistry, but his insistence that actors draw on their deepest traumas felt exploitative and dangerous, particularly for people who were already emotionally fragile. They discussed whether it was possible to be a great actor without destroying yourself in the process. Neither had an answer, but the fact that they could ask the question together was enormously comforting. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the dressing room door, and a publicist's voice calling for them to return to their posts. As they stood to leave, Brando did something impulsive. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket, tore out a page, and wrote down his phone number. He handed it to Marilyn with a simple instruction: "Call me when you need to talk to someone who understands." Marilyn took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it in her purse. Then she pulled out her own lipstick, wrote her number on his palm, and told him the same thing. This exchange of numbers marked the true beginning of their relationship. Everything that followed over the next 7 years grew from those 20 minutes in dressing room 7. When Marilyn and Brando emerged from the backstage area and returned to the lobby, they immediately became the subject of intense scrutiny. Marilyn's lipstick was smudged at one corner of her mouth. Brando's bow tie was even more askew than before, and there was a faint trace of lipstick on his collar. His hair stuck up at odd angles. These visual clues, combined with their 20-minute absence, led everyone to jump to the obvious conclusion. Hedda Hopper, the most feared gossip columnist in Hollywood, made notes in her small leather journal, cryptic shorthand that would later become insinuating prose for her syndicated column. But the truth was far less scandalous and far more interesting. The smudged lipstick and disheveled hair were the result of Marilyn crying at one point during their conversation, overcome by the relief of finally being able to speak honestly about her pain, and Brando awkwardly attempting to comfort her. The lipstick on his collar came from that moment when she had leaned against his shoulder, seeking non-sexual physical comfort that she almost never received. They had not kissed, had not touched each other in any romantic way, but they had connected on a level that was deeper than any affair could have been. The morning after the premiere, Hedda Hopper's column ran with a carefully worded item that managed to insinuate everything while stating nothing directly provable. She wrote about chemistry between certain unexpected pairings, about backstage disappearances and knowing smiles. Her readers understood immediately that she was referring to Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando. Other gossip columnists picked up the thread. Within days, the supposed affair had become one of Hollywood's most discussed secrets, a relationship that everyone claimed to know about but that no one could actually prove existed. The irony was that at this point, there was no romantic relationship to gossip about. They had simply had a meaningful conversation and exchanged phone numbers. But the gossip took on a life of its own, and actually served a useful purpose. It provided cover for what would eventually develop, because once everyone assumed they were already involved, they could meet with less suspicion. The first phone call came 3 days after the premiere. Marilyn was alone in her New York apartment on a Sunday afternoon, feeling the familiar emptiness that always consumed her when she did not have work to distract her. When Brando answered, his tone was casual and warm, as if they had been friends for years. They talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation ranging from acting techniques to current events to their shared disdain for the Hollywood social scene. There was no flirtation, no romantic subtext, just two lonely people connecting. This pattern would repeat throughout 1956, with phone calls every week or two, creating a foundation of trust and understanding. Over the next 7 years, Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando developed one of the most unusual relationships in Hollywood history. It was not primarily a romance, though romance was certainly part of it during a brief period in 1956. It was not a friendship in the conventional sense, because they often went months without seeing each other. What it was, fundamentally, was a lifeline. They were each other's proof that someone else understood the particular hell of being famous, the way that celebrity simultaneously elevated and destroyed. When Marilyn's marriages fell apart, when her dependence on pills spiraled out of control, when studios treated her as difficult and ungrateful, Brando was someone she could call who would not judge her but would simply listen and understand. When Brando's own demons surfaced, Marilyn offered the same non-judgmental acceptance. The relationship remained almost entirely invisible to the public throughout these years. There were no photographs of them together after the Rose Tattoo premiere. They were never seen dining at restaurants or attending parties as a couple. The gossip that had flourished in late 1955 gradually faded. By 1957, most people had forgotten they had ever been linked. This invisibility was carefully maintained. They met only in private spaces where cameras could not follow. Their phone calls were made late at night when they could be confident of privacy. They constructed an entire relationship in the shadows, and that secrecy became part of what made it so valuable. In a world where everything else was public and performed, this was theirs alone. The physical aspect of their relationship seems to have been brief, lasting several months in 1956. What made it significant was not the physical pleasure, but the emotional safety. With each other, they could be vulnerable and imperfect without fear of judgment. Marilyn did not have to perform the Marilyn Monroe sexuality. Brando did not have to prove his masculinity. When they stopped being lovers, probably in early 1957, the transition was natural and unforced. They simply became friends again, or perhaps the friendship had always been the foundation. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, both entered periods of crisis. For Marilyn, the problems were more visible. Her marriage to Arthur Miller disintegrated. Her reputation for being difficult on film sets became open scandal. Her dependence on barbiturates and alcohol reached frightening levels. She was hospitalized multiple times, most traumatically at the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in early 1961, where she was treated like a prisoner. Brando watched from a distance, feeling helpless and increasingly worried. He called her more frequently, but she was often so medicated that conversations were difficult. Brando had his own darkness, though it was less publicly visible. His career was in transition, the meteoric rise giving way to films that underperformed. He was gaining weight, drinking too much, cycling through relationships. He was grappling with the realization that his approach to acting was psychologically unsustainable. Each performance left him more depleted and damaged. When he shared these doubts with Marilyn, she understood completely because she was experiencing the same crisis. The production company that Monroe and Brando discussed forming in 1961 represented their shared fantasy of escape. The idea was to create their own studio, to choose their own projects, to work only on material that had genuine artistic merit. They would be free from studio executives who saw them as products to be exploited. The fact that this company never materialized stands as one of the great what-ifs of Hollywood history. If that production company had been formed, would Marilyn's life have taken a different trajectory? These questions are unanswerable, but they haunt anyone who studies this period. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe was in desperate condition. She had been fired from Something's Gotta Give in June after her erratic attendance made filming impossible. The studio sued her and made public statements calling her unreliable and unprofessional. The press wrote cruel articles about her fading beauty and declining career. She was 36 years old, and in Hollywood's brutal calculus that made her past her prime. The rumored affairs with the Kennedy brothers were in their final stages, with both men apparently trying to distance themselves from an association that had become politically dangerous. She was living alone in her Brentwood house, increasingly isolated, taking massive doses of barbiturates and alcohol just to get through each day. Brando was aware that Marilyn was in trouble, but he was 3,000 miles away in New York dealing with his own complications. They had spoken several times in early 1962, difficult conversations in which Marilyn alternated between manic energy and depressive despair. He had offered to visit, had suggested she come to New York to get away from Los Angeles, but nothing had come of these suggestions. In retrospect, Brando would torture himself with whether he could have done more, whether he should have been more insistent. The phone call that Marilyn made to Brando on August 3, 1962, just 2 days before her death, carries additional weight in the context of their 7-year relationship. When Marilyn called that Friday afternoon, she was reaching out to someone who had been her confidant and ally since that December night at the Rose Tattoo premiere. She was calling the one person in Hollywood who had seen behind her mask and had not turned away. The fear and desperation in her voice was not just about immediate threats, it was the accumulated weight of 7 years of struggling to survive in an industry that wanted to consume her, 7 years of trying to be taken seriously while being valued only as a sexual object, 7 years of fighting addiction and mental illness while being told she was simply difficult. When Marilyn Monroe died in the early morning hours of August 5, 1962, Marlon Brando was destroyed by guilt that would never fully heal. He replayed that final phone call obsessively, analyzing every word, every tone. He convinced himself that there had been clues he should have recognized, warnings he should have heeded, actions he should have taken. The fact that he had not immediately gotten on a plane to Los Angeles, had not called anyone who might have intervened, became a source of torment that would last the rest of his life. Friends tried to tell him that he could not have known what would happen, that there was no way to predict or prevent her death. But Brando could not forgive himself. In the 3 decades between Marilyn's death and the publication of his autobiography in 1994, Brando barely spoke about her publicly. He avoided watching her films, changed the subject when her name came up. The few times he did mention her, usually late at night, and usually when he had been drinking, his comments were cryptic and anguished. He would say things like she knew too much, or they could not let her live, or I should have been there, fragments that hinted at darker knowledge. These comments fed conspiracy theories about Monroe's death, suggesting Brando believed she had been murdered. The decision to finally write about Marilyn in his 1994 autobiography seems to have been both therapeutic and torturous. He was in his 70s, his career largely behind him, his health declining. When he wrote about that Rose Tattoo premiere, about the 20 minutes in Dressing Room 7, about the 7-year relationship, and that terrible phone call in August 1962, he was attempting to honor Marilyn's memory by revealing how much more she had been than her public image suggested. He wanted the world to know that she had been intelligent and vulnerable and desperately seeking something real in a world of artifice. He wanted to confess his own failure to save her, as if public admission could somehow expiate private guilt. The 20 minutes that Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando spent in Dressing Room 7 at the Rose Tattoo premiere on December 15, 1955, changed both of their lives. It was the beginning of a relationship that would provide comfort and understanding during some of their darkest moments, a relationship that existed almost entirely in private and that Hollywood never fully understood. For Marilyn, Brando represented the possibility that someone could see past the Marilyn Monroe persona to the complicated woman underneath and not be disappointed. For Brando, Marilyn represented a fellow survivor of fame's brutality, someone who understood that being worshipped by millions did not prevent loneliness, but often intensified it. The tragedy is that this dream was never realized. Marilyn died at 36, her potential unfulfilled, her struggles unresolved, her death shrouded in mysteries that persist decades later. Brando survived another 42 years, achieving legendary status but never escaping his demons. The guilt over Marilyn's death became part of those demons, an additional source of pain. When he finally died in 2004 at 80, he had long since retreated from public life, a recluse haunted by memories of what had been and what might have been. But the story that began in that dressing room is more than just a tragedy. It is a reminder of the human capacity for connection, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Marilyn and Marlon found each other in the midst of the Hollywood machine, two people being ground up by fame and exploitation, and they created something genuine and sustaining. The relationship did not save either of them from their ultimate fates, but it provided moments of respite, times when they could drop their masks and simply be themselves with someone who understood. In a world that valued them only for what they could produce and how they looked, they valued each other for who they actually were. The photographs from the Rose Tattoo premiere show Marilyn Monroe and Marlon Brando standing together in the theater lobby, both in formal wear, both smiling for the cameras. To the casual observer, they are simply two celebrities fulfilling their obligations, but knowing what we know now, they become something more poignant. They are a record of the moment when two lost souls found each other, when a connection was forged that would last 7 years and end only with death. They are evidence that even in Hollywood's golden age, even in the midst of all that manufactured glamour, real human connection was still possible, and they are a reminder that behind every legend is a person who suffered and hoped and loved, just as vulnerable as anyone else.